Chapter 3, The Transformation of New Left Radicalism. Describing the general logic of the turn among activists to Third World Marxism is not the same as detailing the process as it occurred. This shift did not take place via a simple series of ideological steps. The late 60s movements were too fragmented and diverse for that. No single organization included all or even a majority of the people gravitating toward revolutionary politics. Rather, the young radicals were grouped in a few nationwide formations, many local circles, and various networks particular to one sector of activism. The biggest chasm was that of race. De facto segregation in housing, employment, education, and society in general. The different ways in which oppression was experienced by whites and by different peoples of color. Backward racial attitudes among white activists who had grown up in a racist society. The emergence of Black Power ideology and the call for whites to organize against racism within white communities. All these meant that most radical organizations of the time tended to be race or nationality specific. Organizations were thus exclusively or overwhelmingly made up of blacks, Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, Asians, Native Americans, or whites. Other fault lines divided organizers by geographical area, by age. Many generation gaps could arise between activists just 3 or 4 years apart in a time of such rapid change, by sector, GI organizers, campus militants, and others, and by gender. The process of Marxism gaining influence, and what interpretation of Marxism was embraced, differed based on where individuals happened to be located, and in some cases Marxism gained only rhetorical converts, with previously held notions being simply reformulated using Marxist terms. With all these qualifications in mind, it is still possible to trace the main organizational forms that embodied Third World Marxism in the U.S. Monthly Review and The Guardian. A vital role was played by the periodicals young radicals relied upon for news and analysis. Especially important in countering tendencies toward isolation and narrowness were two widely read independent, that is, non-party, publications, Monthly Review magazine and The Guardian newspaper. Monthly Review, Mr., was founded in 1949 by Paul Sweezy and Leo Huberman, and quickly established itself as an accessible socialist periodical focusing on economic analysis and developments in the Third World. Mr. was an early and enthusiastic supporter of the Cuban Revolution and after some hesitation, backed China in the Sino-Soviet split. Monthly Review's circulation during the late 1960s was 8,000 to 10,000. And it was common for a single copy to be passed around a household or campus and read by many individuals. Mr.'s book publishing arm, Monthly Review Press, established itself as one of the most important left publishing houses and issued a steady output of volumes promoting Marxism, Leninism, and Third World revolutions. Among the most influential, in addition to Baran and Sweezy's Monopoly Capital already mentioned, were Paul Baran's Political Economy of Growth, Carrie Magduff's The Age of Imperialism, The Myth of Black Capitalism by Earl Ferry, Racism and the Class Struggle by James Boggs, and Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeno. The Chinese Cultural Revolution particularly impressed Monthly Review's editors, and Mr. played a bigger role than any other U.S. intellectual institution in promoting the outlook associated with Mao Zedong. In 1966, Mr. Press published Fanchon, a documentary of revolution in a Chinese village by William Hinton, a Pennsylvania farmer who had spent 6 years in China beginning as a tractor technician for the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency. The book, which detailed the social transformation in one Chinese village, was the single most influential volume popularizing the day-to-day work of the Chinese Communist Party. Its paperback edition sold a remarkable 200,000 copies, establishing Hinton's reputation as the period's most authoritative left voice on China. Monthly Review editors Huberman and Sweezy likewise penned an enthusiastic article titled The Cultural Revolution in China for their magazine's January 1967 issue. The piece was reprinted in pamphlet form by the SDS-sponsored Radical Education Project. The Guardian had been founded as the National Guardian during Henry Wallace's 1948 Progressive Party presidential campaign by 3 radical newspapermen, James Aronson, Cedric Belfrage, and John McManus. During the repressive 1950s, the paper played a key role in the defense of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, took a strong stand against the Korean War, and published regular contributions from W.E.B. Du Bois. In the early 1960s, it focused on the civil rights and early anti-Vietnam War movements and added several new generation activists to its staff. These recruits grew increasingly discontented with the structure and leadership of the paper, and in 1967 essentially forced the remaining active founder, James Aronson, to turn control over to the staff organized as a collective. The change marked a generational and political transition from old left to new left, and it was accompanied by a name change to The Guardian. Apparently, some young protesters associated the title National Guardian with the National Guard. To reflect the paper's new sensibility, the masthead slogan was also changed, from Progressive Newsweekly to Radical Newsweekly. After Aronson's departure, the paper lost significant old left financial support. Then backing from the large pro-Israel contingent of otherwise progressives was lost when The Guardian defended Palestinian national rights after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. But aggressive efforts to build ties with SDS, SNCC and other organizers central to the anti-war and black liberation movements bore fruit. By the end of 1969, the paper had doubled its number of pages from 12 to 24 and increased its paid weekly readership to 24,000. The highest total since the paper's initial years. During the late 1960s, The Guardian offered more extensive on-the-spot coverage of national liberation movements than any other U.S. publication. It was an enthusiastic partisan of Cuban and Chinese efforts to build socialism. Its week-in, week-out coverage from Vietnam by correspondent Wilfred Burchett was unmatched. Burchett, who later anchored the paper's equally outstanding Africa coverage, also wrote several books in his 1968 volume Vietnam Will Win. Published by The Guardian and distributed by Monthly Review Press, played a pivotal role in convincing many young radicals that the National Liberation Front held overwhelming popular support in South Vietnam. The paper served as one of the main vehicles for left debate, and among the individuals contributing regularly to the paper's columns were SDS or former SDS activists Greg Calvert, Carol Neiman, Todd Gitlin, and Carl Davidson. Black liberation veterans Julius Lester, Robert Allen, and Phil Hutchings, and former labor activist, future figure in cultural studies Stanley Aronowitz. The Guardian's cultural section became one of its most popular features after former Singao editor Erwin Silber joined the staff as cultural editor in 1968. 4 years later, Silber would become the paper's executive editor, take the lead on ideological questions, and spearhead The Guardian's immersion in the new communist movement. In organizational terms, the key power figure was managing editor Jacques Smith, who had been the leader of the 1967 staff revolt. In 1969 to 1970, The Guardian began to stress specifically Marxist in contrast to broadly revolutionary politics. Advocacy of Marxism-Leninism became a feature of occasional editorials. The paper called for building a socialist movement rooted in the working class and heightened its polemic against those tendencies in the New Left that advocated small groups taking up armed struggle or other anarchist strategies. Such positions provoked a faction sympathetic to the Weather Underground to challenge the staff majority. In April 1970, the dissidents physically seized The Guardian's offices, and the paper's staff kept the paper coming out by pasting up the galleys on one staff member's kitchen table. The majority maintained the support of most regional bureaus and foreign correspondents, including Burchett, and weathered the storm. The insurgents went on to launch the Liberated Guardian, which lasted a year before becoming the local New York City Star. The disruption and split reduced The Guardian's circulation, though not as much as the 1969 collapse of SDS, which had been the paper's largest on-the-ground sales vehicle. In 1971, paid circulation was down to about 18,000, and it took 2 more years to climb back above 20,000. Editorially, the attempted takeover only accelerated the paper's turn toward Leninism and a working-class focus. Between 1970 and 1972, the paper tried to balance advocacy of this outlook with calls for unity of the entire left against the war in Vietnam and in support of black liberation. The paper's pages continued to express enthusiasm for Cuba and tilted strongly toward China in the Sino-Soviet split. The Guardian also called for united action by all socialist countries in defense of Vietnam and gave positive coverage to the CPUSA-centered campaign to free Angela Davis. Standing out as one of the few broad-based radical institutions of the 1960s to sustain itself into the 1970s, the paper's influence on activists just turning toward revolutionary ideas was immense. Aggressive distribution of materials from China's foreign languages press and from Cuba also figured heavily in the 1968 generation's ideological evolution. By the late 1960s, inexpensive copies of writings by Mao, especially the famous Little Red Book, quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, Che and Fidel, as well as Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin, were available in every large city and college town. Young activists were hungry for radical literature, and beyond individuals hitting the bookstores and libraries, thousands launched informal study and discussion groups. Marxist literature was also a staple of the period's wave of free universities and of new radical caucuses within academic associations. Many college courses for the first time included Marxist works in their syllabus. The wave of enthusiasm for Third World Marxist revolutionaries went far beyond individuals who thought of themselves as aspiring Marxist-Leninists. Large contingents in the women's and gay movements, for instance, looked to Mao for ideas about how to practice criticism, self-criticism, combat liberalism, and serve the people. There was a widespread fascination with Mao and Che in the counterculture. Some of Mao's pithier quotations, including more anarchist than Marxist ones like the thousands of principles of Marxism, can be summarized in one sentence: "To rebel is justified," were featured in the underground press. Che's declaration that at the risk of sounding ridiculous, "Let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love," was regularly cited for inspiration by radicals of all persuasions as well as non-activist participants in the era's youth culture. 9. Progressive labor and the revolutionary action movement. Yet the distribution of books and periodicals alone could never have won a new generation to Marxism. An indispensable role was played by organizations in less formal circles on the ground. In the early and mid-1960s, Progressive Labor (PL) was the main group advocating what it called revolutionary Leninism. PL had been launched as the Progressive Labor movement in 1962 by activists who had left or been expelled from the CPUSA because they sympathized with China in the Sino-Soviet dispute. The group quickly established itself as a combative, if small, force on the left. In January 1963, PL launched a campaign to aid coal miners engaged in a bitter and violent strike in Hazard, Kentucky. It then organized student trips to Cuba in defiance of a U.S. government travel ban. In May 1964, PL launched the May 2nd movement as an explicitly anti-imperialist student group opposed to intervention in Vietnam. PL member Bill Epton became a leading figure in the African American movement in Harlem. At the founding rally of Malcolm X's Organization of Afro-American Unity in 1964, Epton was introduced as an honored guest. He was singled out as a leader of the Harlem Uprising a month later and charged with criminal anarchy, sparking a major defense campaign. In spring 1964, PL was strong enough to launch a weekly newspaper, Challenge. A year later it had grown to 300-plus members, and in 1965 it transformed itself into the Progressive Labor Party. PL established ties with the Chinese Communist Party and became the more or less official U.S. representative of Marxism-Leninism. Mao Zedong thought PL's version of Leninism tended toward the schematic, especially after it proclaimed itself a party. Its rhetoric was crude, its internal structure rigid, and its activity frequently sectarian. In the freewheeling early 1960s, these qualities alienated many in the New Left, but PL was also militant. It threw itself into work with youth. It identified with China, Cuba, and the Third World, and it made a serious effort to organize workers. This unique combination attracted a number of talented activists. PL's biggest impact on the new radical generation came after February 1966, when it dissolved the May 2nd movement and sent its members into SDS. PLers functioned as a disciplined caucus and injected a new dynamic into SDS's internal life. On the one hand, PL's forthright advocacy of Marxism and militant anti-imperialism spurred many SDS members and other 60s radicals to examine those positions seriously for the first time. At the same time, PL's tight discipline within the previously loose SDS aroused a great deal of hostility. Soon this hostility extended beyond PL's organizational tactics to the substance of PL's program. Ironically, during the very years in 1967 to 1969, when thousands were turning toward revolutionary politics, PL was moving away from the most popular positions identified with Third World Marxism, hewing to an approach that valued maintenance of revolutionary purity over engagement with real-world social forces. Navigating the inevitable twists and turns of radical advance, PL started to attack the Vietnamese for selling out the revolution by entering into negotiations with the U.S. Similarly, just as China was gaining prestige, PL began to criticize the KP for not denouncing the Vietnamese. Instead of backing the militant wing of the Black Liberation Movement, PL condemned anti-working class nationalism and singled out the Black Panther Party for special venom. And just when stirrings of worker rebelliousness were growing in 1969 to 1970, PL pushed an especially narrow view of working class organizing focused on building student support for wage demands of campus workers. PL's flip-flop transformed the way in which the group influenced the new radical generation. Progressive labor all but completely lost its previous position as a strong if somewhat dogmatic pole of attraction. and instead became viewed as a prime example of what a Marxist-Leninist party was not supposed to be. As a result, a whole layer of new leftists embraced Marxist-Leninist ideas in the course of struggle against the formerly orthodox PL. Though much smaller than PL and not nearly as ideologically coherent, the Revolutionary Action Movement (RAM) also played a significant role in drawing young activists toward Marxism. RAM was founded in 1962 by a core of black activists largely composed of students at Central State College in Wilberforce, Ohio. The group was initially inspired by the ideas and work of Robert F. Williams, leader of the NAACP chapter in Monroe, North Carolina, and an advocate of armed self-defense who was forced to flee to Cuba in 1961. Relocating to China in 1966, Williams published a newsletter, The Crusader, which projected a vision of black revolution, internationalism, Third World solidarity, and armed struggle. RAM, the first independent black Marxist organization of the 1960s, attempted, not very successfully, to develop these ideas into a political program. The group was loosely organized, functioned in a semi-underground manner, and issued the bi-monthly journal Black America and the RAM Speaks newsletter. Several of its central leaders, especially Max Stanford Muhammad Ahmad, developed close ties with Malcolm X. Though never large and not engaged in sustained day-to-day organizing, RAM influenced many people in SNCC as well as individuals who were later to play key roles in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the Black Panther Party. Its influence peaked in 1965 to 1966, but facing government repression and without a viable organization-building strategy, RAM declined and dissolved by 1969. The demise was quiet. RAM's significance had not resided in its organizational strength, but in its popularization of revolutionary nationalist, Marxist, and Maoist ideas during a critical period of the Black Freedom Movement. The central role of the Black Panther Party. Many of the ideas circulating in RAM, especially audacious advocacy of black-led revolution, found their strongest organizational expression in the Black Panther Party, BPP. The Panthers were not a Marxist organization per Southeast, but combined shifting strands of nationalism and Marxism into an eclectic mix. Still, they were the most prominent revolutionary organization in the country during the key transitional years 1968-1971. And they proved to be the most important single organization in the transition of thousands of activists from New Left radicals, Black Power advocates, or Third World militants to partisans of Third World Marxism and Leninism. The BPP was founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California in October 1966. One of their first activities was following Oakland police officers to observe and record instances of racist harassment and brutality. Panther members carried arms while doing this work, which was legal in California at the time, when in May 1967 the state legislature moved to pass a bill making armed citizen patrols illegal. Seale led a lobbying trip to Sacramento during which Panthers were photographed on the state capitol steps carrying shotguns. This photo catapulted the new group into the nationwide spotlight. For the next 3 years the Panthers expanded their membership, developed their practical organizing work, and faced an unrelenting wave of government harassment, infiltration, and violence. The Panthers put their objectives into a 10-point program, published in each issue of their newspaper, The Black Panther. Point 1 read, "We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our black community." Point 3 declared, "We want an end to the robbery by the capitalist of our black community." And point 10 summed up the program with a call for land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace, and a United Nations supervised plebiscite in which only black colonial subjects will be allowed to participate, for the purpose of determining the will of black people as to their national destiny. The Panthers' day-to-day work focused around Serve the People or survival programs, especially breakfast for children programs. But before long the Panthers were forced to devote most of their energy to legal and political defense, growing in size and geographical reach up until early 1971. The Panthers peaked at about 4,000 members in several dozen cities. Eldridge Cleaver, a former prisoner whose book Soul on Ice hit the bestseller list in 1968, joined and served as Minister of Information. The Panthers announced a merger with SNCC in early 1968. The BPP leadership felt that it had eclipsed SNCC and could dominate any partnership, but the two groups never fully unified, and the alliance was declared dead just a few months later, in fall 1968. After publicly terming the Panthers the major internal threat to U.S. security, by Chief J. Edgar Hoover ordered the intensification of COINTELPRO activities directed against the party. COINTELPRO, the BI's counterintelligence program, targeted U.S. radicals in a variety of ways, ranging from disinformation campaigns to theft of movement files to physical attacks. Over the next several years, hundreds of Panthers were arrested and dozens were killed, including 749 arrested and 27 killed in 1969 alone. Party leaders were especially targeted. Following a shootout that left an Oakland police officer dead in October 1968, Newton, who held the actual reins of power within the BPP, was charged with murder. The nationwide Free Huey campaign that followed attracted broad support not only on the left but among prominent liberals and Hollywood luminaries. Convicted of voluntary manslaughter, Newton was later freed on bond, and his conviction was overturned by an appeals court in 1970. Bobby Seale was included in the indictment of 8 activists for conspiracy following the violence at the 1968 Democratic Convention. When he insisted on his right to represent himself at the trial, he was shackled in the courtroom by Judge Julius Hoffman. In 1969, Seale, along with leading BPP member Erica Huggins, was charged with murder after a BPP member suspected of being a police informer was killed in New Haven, Connecticut. The charges against Seale and Huggins were eventually dismissed, and in the Chicago conspiracy trial, Seale's case was severed from the other defendants, and he was never convicted. Through this intense period, the Panthers were the most well-known revolutionary organization in the country. Their main base lay among the poor strata of blacks in the inner cities. The Panthers added the key ingredient of organization to a sector that had demonstrated its capacity to rebel during the urban uprisings of 1965 to 1968. While advocating black leadership not only for the black community but for the entire radical movement, the BPP criticized poor cop or cultural nationalists for putting symbols of identity above political struggle. The Panthers promoted alliances between black revolutionaries, other activists of color, and radical whites, and not simply on paper. The country's first self-identified Rainbow Coalition was organized in Chicago in 1969 by Chicago Panther leader Fred Hampton. It included the Panthers, the Puerto Rican Young Lords, and the Young Patriots, a group of poor, mostly Appalachian whites. While not formulated in classically Marxist terms about working-class unity, the Panthers' rainbow vision lent credibility to proto-Marxist notions about unity across the color line. On other occasions, the Panthers utilized Marxist language, and selling copies of Mao's Little Red Book was one of the activities that drew attention to the Panthers early on. They also denounced anti-communism and red baiting, and occasionally referred to the principles of Marxism-Leninism. The Panthers stressed internationalism and devoted many pages of their newspaper to coverage of liberation struggles in Africa and throughout the Third World. Panther leaders visited China and gave glowing reports upon their return. The BPP also praised Cuba, and that country gave sanctuary to many party members fleeing repression in the U.S. In 1970, Huey Newton publicly offered to bring the entire Panther Party membership to Vietnam to fight on the side of the NLF. The offer was graciously declined. Especially significant was the BPP's character as a disciplined, centrally led cadre party that was attempting to build a base among ordinary people. The Panthers' use of this organizational model, so different from SNCC or SDS, was a watershed in legitimizing the notion of a tight revolutionary party among young radicals. Even though the Panthers did not derive their organizational approach from Leninist theory, they did speak of themselves as a vanguard. For most 60s activists of all colors, contact with the Panthers marked their first encounter with a cadre group claiming that title, except for largely disliked old left groups. The Panthers also explicitly counterposed their vision of revolution against the politics of progressive labor, making the BPP a rallying point for activists who disagreed with PL but wanted to develop a revolutionary Third World-oriented Marxist-Leninist identity. In spring 1971, long-simmering differences within the Panthers, exacerbated by the intense pressure of the government's COINTELPRO campaign, erupted into a violent internal battle. A faction headed by Cleaver, then in exile in Algeria, accused the Newton-dominated leadership of reformism for stressing serve-the-people programs, legal defense work, and popular political education. Cleaver argued that prime attention should be given to armed actions and building an underground. After months of polemics and shootouts, a struggle that gave COINTELPRO many opportunities, the minority supporting Cleaver left or were expelled, some going on to form the underground Black Liberation Army. Newton's faction maintained the party's central operations, but pulled almost all of the remaining membership back to Oakland, where the BPP concentrated on building up local influence through survival programs and electoral activity. They achieved substantial success, especially under Elaine Brown, who took over day-to-day leadership in 1974 when Newton fled to Cuba after being charged with the murder of a prostitute. But the party abandoned most work with the rest of the left and began to recede as a pole of attraction for leftward-moving youth. Perhaps ironically, even the Panthers' factional bloodletting and decline served to push many young people toward Marxism-Leninism. These aspiring revolutionaries continued to embrace the Panthers' advocacy of black leadership, building a base among the dispossessed, and cross-racial alliances, while concluding that a more careful and theoretically grounded approach could tap the strengths the Panthers had demonstrated while eliminating the weaknesses. These weaknesses included problems of sexism, often blatantly expressed, a near-total lack of internal democracy combined with compulsory adulation for supreme servant of the people Huey Newton, use of physical force to resolve differences, and more than occasional participation in drug dealing, theft, and other criminal activities. At the time, most radicals were willing or able to acknowledge these weaknesses only to a limited extent, and placed the problems they did recognize in the context of an organization under violent siege. Many attributed the BPP's shortcomings to the distance the party maintained from core Marxist concepts rather than to its enthusiasm for revolution. In particular, those turning toward Marxism were skeptical of the Panthers blurring the distinction between the impoverished working-class layers of the black community and the sector of petty criminals and unstable individuals whom Marx classified as the lumpen proletariat. They saw this latter sector as the main social base of the negative tendencies in the BPP, as well as the prime recruiting pool for police informants, and believed that a more clear-cut commitment to Marxist theory and to building a base among black workers, rather than the brothers on the block, would have served the Panthers well. Many concluded that taking up Marxism-Leninism was the way to continue the best in the Panthers' legacy. Of course, the impact of the Black Panther Party went far beyond those cadre who turned to Leninism in the late 1960s. For the next decade and more, the Panthers at their zenith were a reference point for the entire black freedom movement and much of the U.S. left in general, and they remain an inspiration for efforts to renew radicalism today. Yet the BPP experience has not had the kind of analytic treatment it requires. Several books have offered a wealth of description and insight, memoirs by Elaine Brown and former party chief of staff David Hilliard among them. But some of the key questions of what exactly went right and what went wrong, to what extent was the BPP's practice was shaped by its leaders' ideology, and to what extent by the class, age, and gender composition of its ranks, and what lessons can be drawn for building a mass revolutionary formation among the urban black population have not yet received the in-depth analysis they deserve. That task is well beyond the scope of this book or the capacity of this author. But even in the absence of a full evaluation, it is imperative to recall that the BPP politicized thousands of African American youth, put forward a program that forced every other organization in the African American community to respond, and more than any other single group spurred young activists of every race and nationality to start down a revolutionary path. Late SDS, I consider myself a revolutionary communist. One of the largest contingents of activists taking that road, and certainly the largest single contingent of white activists, came out of SDS. Signs of a sea change in SDS began to accumulate in 1966 to 1967. Kirkpatrick Sale's meticulously researched history of SDS describes the transition in those years from the old guard to a new breed in which leadership was transferred from the Eastern intellectuals to the Middle American activists, from those born in the left-wing traditions of the coasts to those raised in the individualistic heritage of the frontier. It was the ascendance of what was now known in SDS as prairie power. The new group included more people attending non-elite schools and from working-class backgrounds than the original SDS core. It was put off by what it regarded as the in-group elitism of the old guard and took organizational leadership more by rebellion than by a smooth transition. In general, it was an angrier and more impatient contingent than the original SDS founders. This prairie power generation of SDS leadership included a number of activists who were later to play pivotal roles in the new communist movement, while some of the most prominent advocates of the good 60s, bad 60s framework, including Todd Gitlin, came out of the SDS old guard. Along with this sociological shift came a more concerted effort to delineate an SDS strategy, in particular to identify social forces that could act as agents of radical change. Debate raged about building an SDS that would not focus on changing the educational system but on turning students into radical cadre, and about the political potential of the so-called new working class, people with technical, clerical, and professional jobs that require educational backgrounds. Exploration of such ideas inevitably spurred discussion of class structure and led to more frequent interaction with Marxism, and the encounter with Marxist ideas was accelerated by the entry of PL. Then came the upheavals of 1968 and an influx of members, energy and fury. SDS expanded from roughly 30,000 members and 250 chapters in the fall of 1967 to 80,000 to 100,000 members and 350-400 chapters in November 1968. Beyond the enthusiasm created by sheer numbers, the membership was launching demonstrations and educational campaigns across the country, and thousands of new members were crying out for national coordination and guidance, sending the leadership scrambling to keep up. Simultaneously, direct personal contact was established between influential members of SDS and Cuban and Vietnamese Communist parties. An alliance was forged between SDS, at least its non-PL sector, and the Panthers, extending common work right down to the chapter level. Under the weight of all these influences, Leninist concepts rapidly moved from the margins to the very center of SDS. As early as the spring of 1968, the depth of this change was signaled when Bernardine Dohrn, first elected to national office that year, replied to a question about whether she considered herself a socialist by saying, "I consider myself a revolutionary communist." Dohrn's comment did not mean that SDS's tens of thousands of rank-and-file members identified themselves in the same way, though certainly some of them did. It did indicate that among a few thousand core SDSers, both PL supporters and opponents, Marxism-Leninism had won rhetorical if not yet actual hegemony. This change was underscored by the manifesto that the non-PL faction rallied around later that year, Toward a Revolutionary Youth Movement, drafted by Mike Klonsky, was designed to turn general anti-PL sentiment into a positive program. The document targeted U.S. imperialism as the enemy, analyzed U.S. society in terms of conflict between the proletariat, no mention of a new working class in bourgeoisie, and gave particular attention to the Black liberation movement. It argued that the route to building a working class movement lay through organizing working class youth, building a revolutionary youth movement, RYM, and presented its strategy as a better elaboration of Marxism-Leninism than PL's. As a result, the central debate during SDS's final year was framed as a contest over what strategy best represented Leninism. Voices questioning the premise that Marxism-Leninism provided the best framework for revolutionary politics in 20th-century industrial societies were pushed to the margins. The Weathermen in RYM, the unity among those who opposed Peel was shallow, and differences soon erupted within the revolutionary youth movement camp. One tendency became known as Weatherman, after the title of its spring 1969 manifesto, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows," a line from Bob Dylan's Subterranean Homesick Blues. The other was simply termed RYM. The two groupings maintained a shaky alliance in preparation for the coming battle against PL, which culminated at SDS's June 1969 National Convention in Chicago. At the convention, RYM forces asserted that PL had attacked every revolutionary nationalist struggle of the Black and Latin people in the U.S., Ho Chi Minh, the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, and the Revolutionary Government of Cuba, and declared PL expelled from SDS. The decision, which arguably did not receive majority support among voting delegates, irrevocably split the organization. Within a few months, most SDSers walked away from all the organized factions, and by spring 1970 SDS was altogether gone. PL briefly tried to maintain a campus grouping calling itself the Real SDS, but this effort was soon abandoned. PL also went further in its attacks on Vietnam, China, and all other radical organizations, and over the next several years lost the bulk of its most rooted and talented organizers, many of whom went on to play important roles within the new communist movement. On the RYM side, by late summer 1969, Weatherman and RYM were engaged in bitter polemics. The Weathermen attributed little if any radical potential to the white sector of the working class and argued that armed struggle was on the immediate agenda. Weathermen accepted the proposition that blacks, whites, and other racial groups should organize separately and called for building a white fighting force to support the struggles of peoples of color. Its first major action after the demise of SDS was the Days of Rage protests to bring the war home in October 1969 in Chicago, during which their cadre charged police lines and physically attacked officers. The action had been projected to draw thousands of young radical activists to Chicago, but drew only a few hundred people and resulted in more than 250 arrests and many injuries. Nevertheless, it was evaluated by the Weather leadership as a success in terms of hardening their cadre in preparation for the armed struggle to come. Chicago Panther leader Fred Hampton, in contrast, denounced the action as foolish, non-revolutionary, and conspiracistic. In December, Weatherman convened a war council at which the final decision was made to take the entire organization underground and launch armed struggle. While the number of actual Weather members was always small, perhaps 300 at its peak, its ideas influenced a much larger number of militants, as did the dedication of its cadre and the group's success in carrying out a number of well-publicized bombings without being caught. On the other hand, Weatherman's more revolutionary than thou denunciations of everyone else on the left and their position that all white people except US are backward aroused tremendous hostility in many quarters. Talking glibly about tactics such as assassinating police officers in minority communities in order to bring down repression and thus radicalize more people of color, an outright racist position despite its ultra-revolutionary guise, didn't win many friends among radicals of any color either. The media gave Weatherman immense amounts of publicity, and the group was frequently portrayed as the logical extension of the entire New Left. This pattern unfortunately extended to writers within the left as well. Kirkpatrick Sale's excellent history of SDS, for instance, includes many criticisms of Weathermen but in many ways treats them as the heroes of his tale. Gitlin likewise puts them center stage, though in his interpretation as villains. In one limited sense, this scenario is accurate. Weathermen did represent the natural outcome of one influential strand of 1960s activism, a strand rooted among white middle-class students, ideologically based on moral outrage, committed to direct action tactics, and disconnected from the day-to-day lives of rank-and-file communities. In desperate times, activists coming from that vantage point will take desperate measures, and Weatherman's actions responding to the genocide in Vietnam were as predictable as night follows day. The more unusual fact was that the Weathermen leaders, whose actual practice was far more anarchist than Marxist, felt compelled to argue their politics using Leninist terminology. RYM, in contrast, took seriously the notion of immersing itself in the working class. While opposing PL's attacks on the Panthers and Vietnamese revolutionaries, RYM's core was oriented toward building a group that would look much like the 1962 to 1967 version of Progressive Labor. But RYM was at least formally a broad anti-imperialist youth organization, and there were different views on many issues within its ranks. The group as such dissipated after less than a year of activity, but the ties forged among many of its militants endured much longer. A substantial number of RYM's core members went on to establish Marxist-Leninist collectives, and overall this tendency provided one of the main seedbeds for the new communist movement. The impact of SDVs and collapse. The split and collapse of the largest radical organization of the 1960s was a watershed event. For members on all sides or no side of SDS's factional wars, it was a wrenching, even traumatic experience. But by the time the final explosion came, there was little effort to prevent SDS from disintegrating. The majority of the membership identified less with SDS as such than with the more general concept of the movement. They regarded organizational boundaries as porous and ever-changing and considered all activists as simply movement people. Doctrinal battles were considered more draining than significant. And even though most rejected PL's politics, the idea of leaping from a loose student group into the highly ideological alternatives offered by RYM or the Weathermen was unattractive. Furthermore, the value of a nationwide membership organization for providing political education or programmatic guidance seemed elusive. A badly divided SDS leadership had not offered much along these lines in some time, so the base of SDS resigned itself to the organization's demise and walked away. A different dynamic operated among those several thousand non-PL SDVisers who had by this time become essentially full-time organizers. They had become deeply frustrated at the very looseness and breadth of the organization. PL cadre could view an amorphous SDS as a recruiting pool for their party, but the non-PL revolutionaries lacked but felt they needed a more cohesive organization, intensely focused on this issue, thinking more about taking up non-campus organizing, and believing that a tighter organization would have tremendous potential for growth. They saw less and less value in maintaining a broad student group. Inter-organizational considerations were also framed by the intensity of conflict raging in the broader society. Any radical group aiming for even minimal effectiveness needed a consensus in 1969 greater than it had in 1964. Without some kind of operational unity around at least a few salient issues, were the Panthers mainly to be defended against police violence or criticized as proponents of divisive nationalism? was the main ideological task in the anti-war movement, exposing U.S. imperialism or denouncing an alleged NLF sellout, and without some agreement on priorities for organizing work, no organization could establish itself on a stable footing. Certainly a host of doctrinal points could be up for internal debate, but if a group couldn't develop some measure of unity in action, it would be dead in the water no matter how large its paper membership. But SDS had long passed the point where it could achieve any degree of practical unity. This was the fundamental reason for the widespread sentiment that SDS had reached the end of its life cycle and that its demise was necessary to clear the way for other organizational initiatives. While not as frequently mentioned at the time or since, it is also extremely doubtful that an organization that was essentially all white could have maintained its viability much longer. There were understandable reasons why SDS evolved that way in the particular context of mid-60s movements, but the proposition that an organization aiming to build a base in the working class can foster anti-racist unity or keep its political bearings on racism or any other issue, while remaining exclusively white, is completely unrealistic. Nevertheless, SDS's demise still constituted a major setback. For several crucial years, no effort was made to construct a nationwide student organization based on the political consensus that had been reached among late 60s campus radicals. Such an effort might not have succeeded, but even in failure, it would have offered at least the prospect of maintaining deeper and broader connections between activists on different campuses, as well as between the hundreds who had become 24-hour-a-day cadre and the thousands who had not. And such an effort could have vastly strengthened radical initiative during various 1969-1972 upsurges, in particular filling a vacuum that existed during the 1970 Cambodia explosion, evolution of the Puerto Rican left. In contrast to the role SDLs played among whites, no single organization encompassed the bulk of radical youth of color. As a result, Marxism and Leninism gained influence among them through more varied organizational experiences, and the process was spread out over a longer period of time. The pivotal role of the Black Panther Party has already been highlighted. For several other groups, the Panthers were not just an ideological influence but a direct organizational model. The Young Lords Party (YLP), founded as the Young Lords Organization in 1969, aimed to be a Puerto Rican counterpart to the BPP, and some activists briefly held dual membership in both organizations. The first Young Lords were former Chicago gang members who had gotten politicized and worked closely with the Chicago Panthers, but the center of gravity of the Young Lords quickly shifted to New York City, where three small groups coalesced to found a YOLO chapter. One of these, the Sociedad de Albizu Campos, named for Don Pedro Albizu Campos, president of the Nationalist Party who fought for Puerto Rican independence from the 1920s till his death in 1965, was based mainly among college students. The second was based on the Lower East Side and included members who interacted extensively with other radical formations, and the third, made up mostly of 14 to 16-year-olds, was based in Spanish Harlem. The new group immediately plunged into an ambitious grassroots campaign, focusing on what they had determined was one of Spanish Harlem's most urgent problems: inadequacy of garbage collection in the Harlem barrio. The Young Lords employed a creative set of tactics, including demands for the sanitation department to supply the community with brooms and skillful propaganda to mobilize broad support, fend off police assaults, and win a tangible victory against the unequal distribution of city services. By the fall of 1969, the group was growing rapidly, and in 1970 to 1971 it numbered upwards of 1,000. Its base was much larger and proportionately exceeded the Panthers, especially in reaching beyond youth to include Puerto Ricans of all generations. The New York Lords split with the Chicago group in June 1970 after becoming convinced that most of them had not shed their earlier gang ways, and at that point the group changed its name to the Young Lords Party. Geographical expansion more than made up for the break, and the YLP soon established footholds in Newark, Philadelphia, Bridgeport, Boston, and Detroit, as well as in New York neighborhoods beyond Spanish Harlem. The YLP launched a bilingual newspaper, Parlant, first as a mimeographed packet and then as a full-fledged tabloid on May 1970. In 1970 to 1971 they sold almost 10,000 copies every other week. Ideologically, the Lords began with a mixture of revolutionary, nationalist, and Marxist ideas quite similar to the Panthers. The group's 13-point program was modeled on the BPP 10 points. It declared, "We want self-determination for Puerto Ricans, liberation on the island and inside the United States, and we are revolutionary nationalists and oppose racism." The Lords also included a point that read, "We want equality for women. Down with machismo and male chauvinism." More than many organizations of the period, the Lords waged considerable struggle against sexism inside the organization and promoted anti-sexist views, including criticisms of the mocking of gays and Parlant. The Lords' rapid growth was accompanied by debate over strategy and ideology. Most of the organization's core moved toward socialism and Marxism. Others advocated a kind of militant reformism and left the group. Discussion of the precise relationship between Puerto Ricans on the island and in the U.S. was a central theme, and a decision to try to build a YLP operation in Puerto Rico did not work out well. Faced with government repression as well as mounting strategic complexities, after 1971 the Lords' numbers began to decline. As in so many other sections of the young revolutionary left, organizational and strategic difficulties led many of the most committed militants to try to find solutions via more defined ideological perspectives. Many members, as well as ex-members and sympathizers, turned to more systematic versions of Leninism, and the dominant section of the leadership in 1972 adopted Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought. Another group, Elbaum, was launched in the summer of 1970 by Puerto Ricans and other Latinos who were fighting urban renewal on the New York's Upper West Side. Elbaum started as a much smaller group than the Lords. Its founding members tended to be older, and several had served in the military in Vietnam. The group's early work focused on local housing, education, and employment. It worked to rally community support for bilingual education, community control of schools, and tenants' rights. Within a few years it had developed a student sector and a workers' organization, and Elbaum members began the process that in 1975 would result in launching the Latin Women's Collective, a key institution in the decade's efforts to organize working-class Latinas. Elbaum also initiated a March 1971 conference attended by 1,000 people that jump-started the ultimately successful campaign undertaken by the entire Puerto Rican left and many non-Puerto Ricans to free the 5 nationalist prisoners. The 5 were Lolita Lebrón, Rafael Cancel Miranda, Andrés Figueroa Cordero, and Irvin Flores, who on March 1, 1954 unfurled a Puerto Rican flag and fired weapons from the gallery of the House of Representatives, wounding 5 congressmen, and Oscar Collazo, who was S.H. while trying to attack President Truman during the 1950 uprising on the island. They had been sentenced to prison terms of 50 to 75 years each. 4 were released in September 1979 when President Carter commuted their sentences to time served. Andrés Figueroa Cordero had been released earlier because he was suffering from cancer. He died March 7, 1979. Under the influence of left organizations in Puerto Rico and a number of Marxist veterans with whom the group established contact, Elbaum moved steadily in the direction of Marxism-Leninism. The Cuban Revolution's influence was keenly felt. Among other things, Cuba was the staunchest international supporter of Puerto Rican independence. Systematic study of Puerto Rican history, international developments, and Marxism was undertaken, and in a carefully prepared process the organization formally adopted Marxism-Leninism in 1974 to 1975. The third main group on the Puerto Rican left, and eventually the largest, was the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, PSP. PSP grew out of the Movement for Independence, PIMI, which had been founded on the island in 1959 and had had at least a small presence in New York City since 1960. The 60s worldwide upsurge had a radicalizing effect on the PIMI and on all politics in Puerto Rico, leading to student protests, labor militancy, and anti-war and pro-independence demonstrations. In this context, the PIMI made the decision to transform itself into a Marxist-Leninist party, to expand its activities both within Puerto Rico among Puerto Ricans born, raised, and or living within the U.S. The formal founding of the PSP took place at a Congress in Puerto Rico in 1971. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the group accelerated efforts to develop a broader leadership corps by adding younger U.S.-raised recruits to the mainly Puerto Rican-born older cadre. Organizers threw themselves into struggles for workers' rights and against discrimination as well as support work for Puerto Rican independence. In March 1972, the party began publishing a bilingual supplement to its newspaper, Claridad. PSP began to fill the space opening up by the decline of the Young Lords and also expanded its geographical reach, establishing branches in New Jersey, Philadelphia, Bridgeport, Boston, Chicago, and elsewhere. The PSP regarded Puerto Ricans in the United States as an integral part of a single Puerto Rican nation, and its organizing here was based on the notion of a dual priority: independence for Puerto Rico and the struggle for socialism in the U.S. Its program stated that the PSP is organized to direct the national liberation struggle of our people and to take state power, to transform the present structure completely and direct the working class in the construction of a new society in Puerto Rico, a socialist and revolutionary society. Its primary role in the U.S. is to unleash the national liberation struggle, in all its fury, in the very hearts of North American cities to which a significant portion of our colonized population was forced, and to link that struggle to the struggle for revolutionary transformation of North American society. With the prestige of the radical tradition on the island behind it, a deep bond with Cuba and a base among older workers and intellectuals as well as youth, PSB was able to spread its message quite broadly. More than 2,000 people attended the official founding meeting of the PSB's U.S. branch in the spring of 1973. Together, the combination of PSP, YLP, and Elbaum exposed and won tens of thousands to revolutionary politics in the early 1970s and made Leninism the dominant perspective on the Puerto Rican left, Marxism-Leninism's predominance in the Asian American movement. In few other communities of color did activists have as direct links to homeland politics as among Puerto Ricans. But countries such as Mexico, China, the Philippines, and Japan also had strong lefts within which Marxist-Leninists were dominant. This inevitably influenced the ideological formation of activists of Mexican, Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese descent in the U.S. This pattern continued a tradition played out earlier in German, Finnish, and other European immigrant communities. The Third World liberation movements of the time exerted a powerful influence on all leftward-moving youth, but for many with a particular national heritage it was delivered with special force and or via direct family and personal interactions. For Asian American youth, the influence of dynamic communist movements in Asia intersected with a pivotal moment in community formation in the U.S. The late 60s saw the initial formation of a new Asian American identity, and given the upheavals of the time, radicalism, in particular opposition to war and racism, became embedded within it. A new U.S.-born generation was reaching adulthood. That generation sought a voice in U.S. politics, and it naturally saw that goal as linked with the civil rights movement and the ensuing upsurge in all communities of color. Further, the Asian American communities, then much smaller than they are today, had not yet developed significant infrastructures of liberal progressive organizations to capture some of the awakening generation's energy. The Chinese American community was dominated by the reactionary Kuomintang 6 companies, making the polarization between protesters and the establishment especially sharp. The U.S. nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and concentration camp internment of Japanese Americans, the parents and grandparents of many Japanese American activists, also had a particularly strong impact. All these factors pushed a large proportion of Asian American youth leftwards, and the largest portion of these relatively quickly onto Marxism-Leninism. The Third World strikes at Berkeley and San Francisco State were crucial in the evolution of Asian American radicalism, and after those battles many activists hooked up with or formed collectives to take up community organizing. Two of the earliest and most prominent groups formed in 1969, the Red Guard Party in the San Francisco Bay Area and IWK in New York. Both were mainly but not exclusively composed of young Chinese Americans. From their inception both looked to People's China for inspiration, promoted revolutionary ideas and took up work in Chinatown in addition to campus activism. In January 1970 IWK launched a bilingual newspaper, Getting Together. Both groups were influenced in their earliest stages by the Panthers, and IWK by the Young Lords. The Red Guards started a Panther-modeled free breakfast for children program, and IWK initially advanced a 12-point program. More orthodox version of Marxism steadily gained ground, and in 1971 the two groups merged to form IWK as a nationwide organization. In 1972 the organization made its first attempt to systematically analyze from a Marxist-Leninist perspective the revolutionary situation and the role of our organization. Another revolutionary group, Mao and Che, won over the leadership of the Asian Community Center, a radical project based in San Francisco's Chinatown. Along with IWK and the Red Guards, it stressed the promotion of positive images of People's China, and all three groups sponsored public events featuring films from the mainland that brought out hundreds of people. These opened up contact with pockets of veteran communists who remained in the community, further accelerating the motion toward orthodox Leninism. Los Angeles East Wing Collective and the Bay Area-based J-Town for Japantown Collective were other important groups. A bit later in 1973, the Asian Study Group, launched by a former member of Progressive Labor Jerry Tung, also took up practical campaigns and ideological efforts among Asian Americans. While many young Filipinos participated in the general development of the Asian American movement, a distinct radical Filipino current also took shape. In 1971, the Revolutionary Kalayan Collective was formed in the Bay Area. Similar groups were formed in New York and Chicago. Several of the individuals involved had only recently arrived from the Philippines, where they had worked in or with the Communist Party of the Philippines, CPP, which had been formed by cadre critical of the traditional pro-Moscow party, adopted Mao Zedong thought, and gained leadership of the growing movement against the regime of Ferdinand Marcos. The three U.S. collectives threw themselves into struggles against discrimination within the U.S. and the anti-Vietnam War movement, as well as building support for the anti-Marcos insurgency. The Bay Area Collective began publishing the monthly Kalayan newspaper in August 1971. All three collectives took up and promoted systematic study of Marxism, Leninism, and materials from the CPP. Links were also established between young Filipinos and a previous generation of Filipino communists who had organized among farm workers and cannery workers. After Marcos declared martial law in September 1972, the three collectives led in forming the National Committee to Restore Civil Liberties in the Philippines. The next year, the three local collectives were dissolved and their members, along with the majority of NCRCLP activists and other individuals, founded the Union of Democratic Filipinos, Katipunan Demokratikong Pilipino KDP, to fight on a nationwide basis for anti-imperialist revolution in the Philippines and socialism in the U.S. Marxism in the new Chicano generation. In the Chicano movement, Marxist ideas intersected and contended with variants of nationalism that were more distant from Marxism and held relatively more influence. The largest non-student organization in just after 1968, the Brown Beretsma did not develop in a Marxist direction, though for a time many thought of the group as a Chicano counterpart to the Black Panthers. The kind of cultural nationalism often criticized by the BPP in fact predominated. On campuses, El Movimiento Estudiantil de Aztlan, MECA, formed at a 1969 conference in Santa Barbara that transformed previously scattered groups into a single organization, endorsed the general concept of Chicanismo, whose main thrust was to reject assimilation into mainstream white America and to promote activism based on self-respect and pride in the Chicano heritage. Within this framework, members of MECA held a range of radical, nationalist, and reformist perspectives. Advocates of Marxism did not hold sway, but they influenced numerous other activists and conducted an ongoing polemic against what they saw as dead-end cultural nationalism that points to a form of struggle that does not take into account the interconnectedness of the world and proclaims as a solution the separatism that the capitalist has developed and perpetuated in order to exploit working people further. Likewise, Marxism did not predominate within the La Raza Unida Party, RAP, probably the most broad lay-based center of Chicano militancy between 1970 and 1972, but members of the organization's labor committee in Southern California and their allies in New Mexico and other states formed a Marxist pole and stressed the importance of sinking roots in the Chicano working class. These activists would later form the Marxist-Leninist August 29 movement, ATM. Building a working-class base was also the top priority for Casa Hermandad General de Trabajadores, Center for Autonomous Social Action, General Brotherhood of Workers, which had been formed in 1968 mainly by veteran labor organizer Bert Corona and rapidly attracted a number of younger Mexican-American activists. CASA built a substantial base in its targeted constituency as well as among student and ex-student militants during the early 1970s. Its early work focused on providing services to and defending the rights of undocumented Mexican immigrants. Marxism was the dominant ideological perspective within CASA, and some members had ties with Mexico's sizable and sophisticated communist movement. That movement and its close ties to the Cuban Revolution exerted an influence both within CASA and among young Chicano and Mexicano militants well beyond its ranks. CASA gave great weight to the link between the struggles in Mexico and the U.S. and promoted the concept sin fronteras, without borders, also the name of the organization's newspaper. We do not distinguish between the Mexican born on this side of the border and those born south of that border. We recognize that border as an imperialist means of separating workers of the same nationality who are exploited as cheap labor by the same source of capital. Finally, a significant role in spreading Marxist idea was played by the Marxist current within the early 70s movement for Chicano studies. 31 by radical artists who organized groups such as the Mexican-American Liberation Art Front and linked the new generation to the tradition of Mexican revolutionary artists such as David Alfaro Siqueiros and Diego Rivera. and by organizers who rooted themselves in community projects and the new wave of radical community-based newspapers, such as former SNCC staffer Elizabeth Betita Martinez, who edited El Grito de El Norte in northern New Mexico and coordinated the Chicano Communications Center. Marxist ideas also established a foothold within the Native American movement, though the details and history of this process remain largely unwritten about, as well as a subject of substantial controversy. It seems a consensus that no Marxist cadre groups or organizing collectives formed on an explicitly Marxist basis, and there was no organized Marxist tendency within the American Indian movement, AIM. But a number of individual Indian activists embraced Marxism, and in the early 70s several put together ongoing Marxist study groups. Connections were strong between Marxist-oriented activists in the US and Canada. AIM was a cross-border organization, and Marxist influences were strong north of the border. Almost all sectors of the Indian movement expressed solidarity with armed liberation movements in the Third World. When the International Indian Treaty Council was established in 1974, in part to internationalize the Indian struggle in the wake of Wounded Knee, representatives of Marxist liberation movements were present, and some Indian activists conceived of the council as a liberation front in Marxist terms. Still, the outlook of Indian elders and traditionals, rooted in a different view of the relationship between human beings, the land, nature, and technological development, and with a strong spiritual dimension, exerted a greater and more lasting pull on the new generation of Indian militants than did Marxism. The League of Revolutionary Black Workers, within the Black Liberation Movement, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers never became as widely known as the Black Panther Party or SNCC, but between 1969 and 1971 it had a more concentrated ideological impact on young activists of all races moving toward working-class politics. From the moment a group of black radicals calling themselves the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, DRM, spearheaded the first wildcat strike to close the Dodge main plan in 14 years, May 2, 1968, word began to spread that something exciting was being born. Within weeks, hundreds of workers were attending DRM-sponsored rallies, challenging the United Auto Workers leadership for its complicity with systematic discrimination against black workers in the plants, and flocking to newly formed Revolutionary Union movements, RUMs, at other factories. This outpouring of militancy scared auto company executives so much that, as the excellent History of the Movement by Dan Georgiakis and Marvin Sirkin, in Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, put it, no less an authority that the Wall Street Journal took them DRM very seriously from the day of the first wildcat, for the Wall Street Journal understood that the Black Revolution of the 60s had finally arrived at one of the most vulnerable links of the American economic system, the point of mass production, the assembly line. Indeed, there was much for journal readers to worry about. A new explosive element in the factories of the late 60s was the presence of 250,000 black workers. They invariably got the jobs requiring the greatest physical exertion, and jobs which were the noisiest, dirtiest, and most dangerous in the plant. Blacks were further abused by the 90-day rule, under which workers could be dismissed at will before coming under full contract protection. The exploitation experienced by all workers was compounded for black workers by the institutional racism which pervaded every aspect of factory life. Dodge Main was typical. 99% of all general foremen were white, 100% of all superintendents were white, and 90% of all skilled apprentices were white. All the better jobs were overwhelmingly dominated by whites, and when whites did have difficult jobs, there were often two workers assigned to a task that a black worker was expected to do alone. The company was not even subtle in discrimination. Sick notes signed by black doctors were refused as inadequate, fueled by such inequities. Support for DRM and its counterparts mushroomed during summer and fall 1968. Then in June 1969, the various RUMs joined together to officially found the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. The League's talented leadership team included veterans of the Revolutionary Action Movement, SNCC, and a number of other formal and less formal radical groupings in Detroit's black community. General Baker and Chuck Wooten anchored the group's in plant organizing. Ken Cockrell, a brilliant tactician and lawyer, later became a Detroit City Council member and mayoral candidate. John Watson brought journalistic expertise and breadth of vision to the group, and Mike Hamlin played a key role in forging unity both within the organization and with potential allies. Expanding its work step by step within the auto plants and in community and student organizing efforts, the League sought to avoid Panther-style confrontations with police with their corollary effect of getting bogged down in legal defense. As of January 1970, it could declare that no one in the League's orbit had been killed by police or sentenced to jail. The League insisted that the working class would make the revolution, with black workers, situated at the intersection of class exploitation and racial oppression, at the pivot. The League's prominence grew further after James Foreman, well known for his contribution as executive director of SNCC, moved to Detroit in 1969 and joined the group's central staff. Profiles of the League and interviews with its leader soon filled the radical media. The most powerful picture was drawn by the film Finally Got the News, a documentary about the group's work released in 1970. Activists across the country responded with enthusiasm to the film's message that revolutionary politics could take root within the working class. Despite its commitment to class politics, the League was never a purely Marxist organization. Members espoused mixtures of Marxism and nationalism, and even those who considered themselves Marxists were divided on various doctrinal and strategic issues. In 1971, these differences sharpened within the leadership and split the organization. The story of former League members' subsequent efforts belongs more to the history of the new communist movement, see Chapter 4, than to the chronicle of how Marxism initially won broad influence among the generation of 1968. SNCC and the Third World Women's Alliance. Meanwhile, SNCC, which had played such a crucial role through the mid-1960s, fell into increasing factionalism after 1967 to 1968. Many of its organizing projects deteriorated, a number of its most effective organizers departed, and the never-consolidated merger with the Panthers ended with considerable bad feeling. Post-merger efforts to rebuild did not bear fruit, and instead factionalism increased, and key leaders like Stokely Carmichael and James Foreman left or were expelled. In 1969, an extreme nationalist faction took control of the remnants of SNCC, and after that it ceased to have much practical or ideological impact. An exception to this downward trend was SNCC's Black Women's Liberation Committee. With SNCC veteran Frances Beale at the forefront, the committee was launched in 1968 and soon broke away from SNCC to form the Independent Black Women's Alliance. In 1970, it expanded to include Puerto Rican and other women of color and became the Third World Women's Alliance. TWW pioneered in developing and promoting the concept of triple jeopardy and published a newspaper of that name, that women of color faced the combined and intersecting burdens of capitalism, racism, and sexism. While not an explicitly Marxist organization, TWW encouraged the study of Marxism and Leninism, and in the mid-1970s its core leadership went on to play a role within the new communist movement, nationalist rivals to Marxism. The mid and late 1960s also saw the rise of a number of black organizations that advocated revolution and utilized some Marxist concepts but mainly posed an opposition between nationalism and Marxism, shunned political cooperation with whites, and were frequently hostile to black revolutionaries who favored cross-racial alliances. Several of these also downplayed the importance of mass political activism in favor of a stress on cultural and spiritual transformation. Ron Kerrigan was an early and extremely influential leader in this current. Kerrigan formulated the Kawaida tradition in Swahili theory of cultural and social change from which the Kwanzaa celebration is derived. Kerrigan founded the U.S. organization in Los Angeles, and for several years Utes and the Panthers were the main poles in the period's acrimonious debate over cultural nationalism versus revolutionary nationalism, as well as in face-to-face violent confrontations, fanned if not initiated by COINTELPRO. The U.S. did not develop into a strong or nationwide organization, not least because it did not prioritize community-based mass action. Kerrigan's ideas spread widely within the black movement. More activist-inclined nationalist groups gave less attention to cultural matters but shared U.S.'s distrust for the taint of white ideologies. Stokely Carmichael moved in this general direction, declaring in 1968 that communism is not an ideology suited for black people and that blacks required an African ideology which speaks to our blackness, nothing else. It's not a question of right or left, it's a question of black. In 1969, after spending time in Guinea, Carmichael founded the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, APRP, and changed his name to Kwame Ture. The APRP, which identified itself as Pan-Africanist, argued that Africa lay at the center of liberation for all people of African descent, and that struggles in Africa, if not relocation to that continent, needed to be at the center of African American politics. A different nationalist strategy was put forward by the Republic of New Africa, RNA, founded in 1968 in Detroit. RNA declared that African Americans should form their own independent state in the South and conducted practical campaigns toward that end, including an attempt to physically establish a new African capital in Hinds County, Mississippi in 1971. The large turnout, over 3,500, at the founding conference of the Congress of African People, CAP, in 1970 indicated the influence of these diverse nationalist strands. Participants ranged from elected officials such as Gary Indiana Mayor Richard Hatcher to Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam to Jesse Jackson from SELC's Operation Breadbasket, noted playwright and author Amiri Baraka, formerly Teroy Jones, who had been playing a key practical role in the African American movement in Newark, emerged as a key nationalist spokesperson and CAP leader. A few years later, his dramatic turn to Marxism-Leninism would bring the new communist movement its best-known figure. Slightly later, in 1972, a new coalition took shape that brought together not only the main nationalist groups but more Marxist-oriented revolutionary nationalists and Marxist-Leninists as well. This was the African Liberation Support Committee, ELSC, launched following a 1971 trip to Africa by a number of activists from the Youth Organization for Black Unity, MYOBU, founded as the Student Organization for Black Unity in 1970, and Malcolm X Liberation University, MXLU in North Carolina, founded in 1969. Ties were forged with the organizations leading the independence struggles in Portugal's African colonies, especially the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, FRELIMO, and Amilcar Cabral's African Party for the Independence of Guinea and the Cape Verde Islands, PAGE. The U.S. activists returned committed to build a strong solidarity movement, and much impressed by the Marxist views of these African movements. ALSC rapidly built a nationwide network of local chapters and was able to mobilize 100,000 demonstrators in 30 cities for African Liberation Day, May 26, 1973. The ALSC's leadership included a large contingent from the South, including Osua Sadoke, head of MXLU, who was elected ALSC's chair. Sadoke, key YOBU members and other central figures were shifting from nationalism toward Marxism, and ALSC as such soon reflected this change. In June 1973, ALSC declared itself an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist Black United Front which encourages Black workers to take the lead. Through that year in 1974, the ALSC was the site of a sustained and very public debate about strategies for Black liberation, within which Marxism-Leninism gained influence at the expense of the more strictly nationalist views. The prestige of Cabral, who was assassinated January 20, 1973 by agents of Portugal in Conakry, Guinea, FRELIMO and other African communists played a key role in moving sentiment in this direction. Hegemonic discourse of Black radicalism, transcending organizational lines, an outpouring of Marxist analyses of Black oppression and Black liberation also drew large numbers of Black and non-Black activists toward Marxism. A key forum for such material was the Black Scholar magazine, which was launched in 1969 and quickly achieved a circulation of 10,000, though carrying articles expressing the full range of radical viewpoints within the Black movement. The magazine frequently featured Marxist pieces as well as consistently positive coverage of Marxist-led African movements, Cuba and China. Marxism was also the theoretical foundation for a number of influential books by Black intellectuals, especially James Boggs's Manifesto for a Black Revolutionary Party, 1969, and Racism and the Class Struggle, 1970, Robert L. Allen's Black Awakening in Capitalist America, 1969, which offered the period's most extensive presentation of the domestic internal colonialism thesis, and Earl Laferrie's The Myth of Black Capitalism, 1970. The combined impact of all this organizational and intellectual ferment led even Stanley Aronowitz, a harsh critic of Marxism-Leninism, to conclude that like other sections of the American left, many Black movement activists adopted Marxism-Leninism as the guide to their action. A version of Marxism merged with nationalism became the hegemonic discourse of Black radicalism. Beyond the Black liberation movement, but like ALSC drawing strength from direct contact between North Americans and Third World revolutionaries, the Venceriums Brigade (VB) also pulled many young organizers toward Marxism. The idea of organizing U.S. activists to work and travel in Cuba originated after a delegation from Estivas went to Havana in 1968. The 1st Brigade, with 216 participants, left for Cuba in November 1969. A much larger 2nd Brigade went in March 1970, and soon the brigade was institutionalized as one of the most imaginative enterprises ever undertaken by the American left. The VB not only provided hundreds of activists with an opportunity to interact with Cuban communists on a day-to-day basis while picking sugarcane or building houses, It also developed a nationwide structure, which still exists for organizing within the U.S. The brigade focused on building solidarity with Cuba, but its political education programs popularized socialism and Marxism, and its structure served as a vehicle through which aspiring U.S. revolutionaries could build ties with one another. The brigade gave priority to recruiting young people of color and became a key site of ideological development as well as networking among Black, Puerto Rican, Chicano, and Asian American activists. In this capacity, the Vencerium's brigade served as the main bridge leading from vague radicalism or nationalism to Marxism for many activists of color. Leninism, the common sense of revolution. For each individual, the route to Marxism was slightly different, but threaded through thousands of stories was one overriding theme. Marxism in its Leninist, Third World-oriented version won influence because in broad outline it made more sense than any other available framework. Marxism-Leninism provided a worldview unmatched in scope, depth, and revolutionary lineage. It revealed the structural roots of and connections between war, discrimination, violence, and the bloc channels of the country's formerly democratic political system. It foregrounded precisely the issues, imperialist war and domestic racism, which topped the 1960s protest agenda. It provided an ideological link and potentially organizational ties to a powerful constellation of revolutionary parties mainly but not exclusively in the Third World. Above all, Marxism-Leninism offered strategic direction to channel the energy of zealous young activists. Even one of Leninism's sharpest critics, former SDS President Karl Oglesby, in his landmark 1969 article Notes on a Decade Ready for the Dustbin pointed to the deep roots of Marxism-Leninism's appeal, because there was no way to resist the truth of the war, no way, that is, to avoid imperialism. B. Because once the policy critique of the war had been supplanted by the structural critique of the empire, all political therapies short of socialist revolution appeared to become senseless. And C. Because the necessity of a revolutionary strategy was in effect the same thing as the necessity of Marxism-Leninism, there was and is no other coherent, integrative, and explicit philosophy of revolution, emphasis in original. Oglesby warned of great dangers in swallowing Leninist orthodoxy whole, so did other insightful activists. Veteran SNCC organizer Phil Hutchings, among others, criticized the Eurocentric biases of the old doctrinaire, or new doctrinaire, white theory that passes for Marxism-Leninism in this country and called for Third World people to take the lead in creating a new Marxism-Leninism. Oglesby, Aronowitz, and others stressed Marxism-Leninism's shortcomings in dealing with realities of an advanced industrial country in the second half of the 20th century. There was no shortage of voices pointing out the problems of societies under Leninist one-party rule, China and Cuba as well as the USSR. Some aspiring revolutionaries disregarded these cautions altogether, but for most, including Hutchings, who later became active in the new communist movement, adopting Marxism-Leninism did not mean ignoring these dangers, it simply meant weighing them differently. Dogmatism had its enthusiasts, but for most activists the turn to Third World Marxism was not an embrace of mechanical formulas or outdated doctrinal tenets. Rather, it meant signing on to a broad ideological tradition that offered focus and direction to the energy unleashed during the 1960s. Intellectually, young activists turned to Marxism-Leninism because they saw in it a framework for furthering, not halting, by their journey of discovery and demystifectionic. Indeed, many saw Third World Marxism as offering a path to the revitalization of the Marxist tradition, not least by breaking it free of Eurocentric models and limitations. Besides its intellectual appeal, Marxism-Leninism offered a link between ideas and concrete practical work. It compelled a collective effort and suggested a concrete organizational form that seemingly had stood the test of history. Of crucial importance, it offered a path for breaking down segregation within the left and building multiracial formations on the basis of a common revolutionary perspective. How could such prescriptions not appeal to youth formed in the heat of surging mass movements and watching 2-3 many vitents break out across the globe? Surely a shrinking U.S. empire only meant sharpening domestic conflicts and the likelihood of revolutionary opportunities not too far ahead. Under such circumstances, the only responsible course was to increase the number of cadre and construct a tightly knit revolutionary leadership. Otherwise, the next revolutionary chance would be missed, just as power was seemingly left lying in the streets of Paris in 1968, because no vanguard existed to lead the spontaneous upsurge. On-the-ground experiences reinforced the grandiose logic of historical analogy. The ideologically eclectic groups of the late 1960s had proved unstable. The Panthers, SDS, the young lords, all had aroused aspirations for sweeping social change and all had grown rapidly for a time, but their very success led to intense repression and confronted them with the challenge of sustaining large-scale coordinated work that could win immediate victories while simultaneously moving closer to ultimate revolutionary objectives. Without a more defined political framework, without some agreed-upon procedures for both organizational democracy and discipline, it simply was not possible to meet this challenge, an international phenomenon. Young activists in the United States were hardly alone in thinking along these lines. The years immediately following 1968 saw the rise of a new revolutionary left worldwide. Anti-imperialist youth and student movements were a global phenomenon, inspired by Vietnam and Ethiopia, Ecuador, India, Thailand, Peru, Puerto Rico, Uruguay, Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, Indonesia, Pakistan, Greece, Turkey, Panama, Mexico, Italy, Spain, Japan, Belgium, France, West Germany, and the United States. To make only a partial list, these movements spontaneously acted in solidarity with one another. The specific ideological contours within this new revolutionary current varied from country to country, but almost all its components defined themselves as to the left of pro-Soviet communism, looked positively on the Leninist tradition, defended the legitimacy of armed struggle, and located the center of gravity of contemporary political struggle in the Third World. Within the Third World itself, young people holding such views gravitated toward pre-existing armed liberation movements or formed new ones of their own. For example, a host of new organizations combining political and military action were formed in Mexico, Argentina, and across Latin America, and the generation of 1968 spearheaded a revival of armed struggle in the Philippines. But Western Europe and Japan were affected as well. In the aftermath of the rebellions and strikes from 1967 to 1970, guerrilla groups and new communist parties formed throughout the industrialized countries in the belief that they could accomplish what the actions of millions of people had failed to do: destroy the existing system so that a new society could be born. Thus currents influenced by Third World Marxism, essentially counterparts to the new trend taking shape in the US, formed in Japan, Canada, Great Britain, and across Western Europe. France's new revolutionary wave drew directly on the energy of May 1968, and West Germany's built on years of activism by that country's Sozialistisches Studentenbestand, SDS, whose militant internationalism had led it to break with its parent Social Democratic Party, paralleling US SD's break with its own original Social Democratic sponsor. Italy's new extra-parliamentary left attained the greatest influence of all, fueled by the militancy of 1969's Hot Autumn and rooting itself in long-standing indigenous traditions of opporsamo, worker self-organization and militancy at the factory level, as well as sympathy for Third World movements. Its three main organizational currents, Lotta Continua, Il Manifesto, and Avignorda Operaia, each grew to about 15,000 members. The fact that thousands of their generational counterparts from Europe to Latin America to China all seemed to be taking the same road only confirmed US activists' conviction that they were following in the footsteps of those who had forged a revolutionary communist international from the wreckage of opportunist socialism 50 years before. Mistaken judgments. In hindsight, we can see fundamental flaws in historical judgment and ideological framework at work. A central problem was outright misassessment of how ripe capitalism was for defeat. This error was fundamental to the failure of the entire revolutionary left, but in the late 1960s just about everyone, including many capitalists themselves, underestimated the economic resilience of capitalism, and in particular its capacity to harness the scientific and technological revolution to its advantage. Young revolutionaries likewise misjudged the main powers arrayed against Western imperialism worldwide, the self-identified socialist countries and the national liberation movements. Regarding the latter, the dynamism Third World movements displayed during the 30 years following World War II led late 60s radicals to an exaggerated evaluation of their potential. Many liberation movements succeeded in winning political independence from technologically superior Western powers via popular mobilization and people's war, but the material basis did not exist for these same movements to sustain economic development along socialist lines, even when assisted by more developed powers such as the USSR. Thus they could not serve, beyond the national independence stage of their struggles, as the bulwarks of anti-capitalism that most 1960s activists anticipated. Similarly, the fact that from the late 1940s to the mid-1970s nationalism manifested itself overwhelmingly as a progressive anti-imperialist and anti-racist force led the 1968 generation to one-sided generalizations about that explosive and contradictory phenomenon. 60s activists generally concluded from their experience that within nationalist movements, revolutionary nationalism would always hold initiative, and that revolutionary nationalism itself was only a hair's breadth away from working-class internationalism. This view left 60s veterans ill-equipped to deal with other periods, like the present, when many of the most powerful nationalist movements advance conservative social and economic agendas, are indifferent or hostile to pan-third world or international working-class solidarity, foster chauvinist attitudes toward other peoples, and initiate divisive ethnic conflicts. Though most of the new revolutionary generation did not have a positive view of the USSR, a large proportion came to accept the argument that the one-party state and administrative command version of central economic planning pioneered by the Soviet Union were indispensable elements of socialism. Many decided that China was forging a new, more democratic socialist path. And most believed that China was both politically correct and ideologically principled in its conflict with the USSR, instead of realizing that the Sino-Soviet split was a disaster for the entire global alignment against Western imperialism and the result of realpolitik maneuvering nationalism and factional interests on both sides. Again, young U.S. radicals were not alone in such judgments about the socialist world, which were shared by many older, more experienced radicals and wide layers of the intelligentsia. The fact is that the 60s radicals knew very little about what had really happened in the USSR or what was actually taking place in China. They tended to judge the contradictory information they did receive by the standard of how strongly one or another source seemed to oppose U.S. imperialism. And given the strong overlap between harsh critics of the communist-ruled countries and those who vacillated in opposition to imperialism's foreign wars, they tended to dismiss their arguments without the serious investigation they deserved. It should also be noted that much hard information about the leadership abuse and arbitrary violence that infused China's Cultural Revolution was not readily accessible in the late 1960s. Only after 1976 did evidence become widely available that the mass struggle campaigns that supposedly were empowering ordinary people and staving off the rise of a new ruling elite had done nothing of the sort. Rather, because of a voluntarist approach that did not link mass action to economic, technological, or intellectual development or to constructing institutions for working-class democracy, as well as omnipresent manipulation by CPC leaders, military figures, and demagogues, they set back China's development and alienated a whole generation from Marxism and from politics in general. Likewise, the most devastating chronicle of the USSR's Stalin period from a socialist inside the Soviet Union during those years, Roy Medvedev's Let History Judge, was not published in the US until 1972. Moreover, even 20 years later, many people beyond the communist movement were taken by surprise when the full depth of problems in the command-administer model began to be revealed under Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika, and in a different way by China's unmistakable turn toward capitalism. The thinking process of the 1968 generation was captured by Italian communist Lucio Magri in 1989. It is now fashionable in the West, even on the left, to consider the October Revolution and its sequel not as a process which degenerated in stages but as a regression from the beginning, but the historical reality is rather different. First Stalinism, then the authoritarian power of a bureaucratic imperial caste, were one side of that historical process, and we were wrong not to have seen its effects in time and denounced it in its roots. But for decades another side also continued to operate, the side of national independence, the spread of literacy, modernization, and social protection across whole continents, the resistance to fascism and victory over it as a general tendency of capitalism, support for an actual involvement in the liberation of 3/4 of humanity from colonialism, containment of the power of the mightiest imperial state. It is hardly surprising that activists whose day-to-day experience involved combating U.S. genocidal violence, and for whom Stalin was a historical figure demonized mainly by those conducting that violence, would see that second, progressive side of the earlier Soviet experience, and would be inspired by the claims made for the Cultural Revolution in China. Even beyond these misassessments, however, many elements of Third World Leninism were at the least overly rigid. Among the most cited today is underestimation of the importance of democracy, both within the revolutionary movement and if and when a revolution succeeds within the new society. Likewise disastrous was the tendency to confer vanguard status on a party because it espoused a sanctioned version of Marxism-Leninism rather than because it actually has won the allegiance of workers and the oppressed. Indeed, the very proposition that there is one and only one correct revolutionary doctrine, and that this doctrine finds expression in one pure tradition that has defeated a series of deviations since Lenin's time, is flawed. The proposition that maintaining a revolutionary stance above all meant hewing to the orthodox road was a time bomb for all who turned to Leninism at the end of the 1960s. Much more evidence in later chapters will show how devastating that time bomb proved to be. But in the years when thousands first turned to Third World Marxism, these dangers seem far in the background.